Leah, welcome to the show. Since 2007, you have been a maternal child healthcare professional working in research, hospitals, and clinics with a focus on infant feeding, reproductive care, femme health, and parental education. For the past few months, we've been sort of going back and forth trying to schedule this discussion, and we finally were able to do it. So thank you for your patience and for joining us today for a discussion on decolonization and mental health. But before we dive into the meat of this conversation, I wanted to ask, where did this whole entire journey for you begin? What was the first time you recognized your interest in mental health care, and how have you changed as a healthcare professional over the years?
Oh, that's such a loaded question. Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be here. I've been following you, I think, since like a year after you got on, and it's been amazing and really satisfying to see how you've evolved. So I'm
Yeah.
happy to be. Yeah, it's. I think evolution's a good description. Hopefully, you agree.
Definitely.
But in terms of my own evolution in my field, you know, if I had to pick one, like the vertex point, like the point where just everything like diverges from my original plan, which was to be a speech language pathologist and like do developmental research on the acquisition of language. So
Hmm.
like that's adjacent to psychology, and one of my degrees is speech language pathology, although I hardly use it at all anymore.
Hmm.
Um, I had the opportunity to go to Costa Rica, and originally I was supposed to go somewhere else, and the trip that I was going to go to just like filled up, where I was going to be like working with school children or whatever in language acquisition.
Hmm.
And so they were like, well, we still have a position, and it's still in Central America. It was in Costa Rica, but it's actually going to be with sex workers who like have been separated from their kids. So like you'll be dealing still with child issues, but it's more with the parents than with the children. And I was
Hmm.
like, I don't know, at the time I was 19 or 20, and I was like, I just want to get out of the country. Sure, whatever, I don't care.
Hmm.
Like it's not going to count towards hours in my degree.
Hmm.
But it sounds like a really cool experience, so I'm going to go do that anyway. And I just was enthralled. And when I say enthralled, that encompasses so many emotions. Like there was rage, I was frustrated, I was fascinated, when I got there. And I grew up really sheltered. And so I guess not as sheltered as some people, but like certainly enough to have no concept of how different the life of someone who was in sex work, especially who had been trafficked, which was the case for a lot of our clients that we were dealing with when I went down there,
Hmm.
was like. And it just blew my whole world wide open. And I fell in love with the work, not necessarily with the circumstances. I fell in love with the advocacy.
Hmm.
And a couple summers later, I got the opportunity to go to South Africa and do a formal internship with some doctors at Loma Linda, the Giordano's actually, um, with mothers and grandmothers who were at risk for or who had already contracted HIV
Hmm.
and their babies. And that was really when everything sort of came together. And it varied. Some of them were housewives, some of them were sex workers, some of them were healthcare workers. It was pretty diverse, the backgrounds that they came from. But the sexual transmitted disease situation in South Africa, especially, like this is 12, 13 years ago,
Hmm.
no, 14 years ago, at the time, is just vastly different than anything that we can imagine in the United States, for all of the reasons you can imagine. Privilege, economics, colonialism, apartheid, like
Hmm. Hmm.
everything that still exists. It was amazing. It was just it was so much intersectionality. It was the intersectionality of culture, of international politics when it comes to like the availability of medication. It was the crux of mental health, because in other cultures that are more in touch with their indigenous roots, like the it's really, really difficult for them to conceive putting into practice the things that are recommended, like on a global health scale, to avoid contracting or vertically passing on viruses, because it involves a lot of distance, like physical distance and affection distance between them and their loved ones. And,
Mm-hmm.
we, in our culture, all of us, regardless of what our ethnicities are, if you grow up in a westernized culture, you become accustomed to like a lot of coldness and a lot of social separation. And we wouldn't look at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But any of us who are not white and who have any family who are still, who are not yet integrated, we know that there's a huge difference in perception of like personal space and all of this other stuff. And so being over there and having to try to teach them like, oh, you cannot touch this kid who's crying at all until you put gloves on. It was really intense. And I sort of became the intermediator between folks who were in a very colonial mindset and like people who were one generation removed from being actually indigenous,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to find a culturally relevant way to reduce viral transmission, but still honoring them in their journeys and their grief, and just the way that this foreign object, for lack of a better word, of like looking at HIV was really, really infecting every part of their culture, not just their bodies, and I think for the people who were there, it was the way that it was disrupting their relationships that was more grievous to them than the actual like fear around STIs, which is like something that we internalize more as Americans, you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 14 years ago, and we didn't have, I think, at UCLA, which is where I ended up going immediately thereafter in the beginning of my career, we didn't have all of the, I shouldn't say we didn't have it. Intersectionality has been around since like the 90s. That's when it was first coined, but it wasn't really in pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I have a lot of privilege professionally for that to have been integrated into my mindset really early on. But those two things are what fuel me. And I came back and I worked, I hate the term inner cities, but I worked in, if you were in LA for a while, right?
No,
I know you're in Texas now.
North California,
Oh,
actually.
you were
Yeah.
in Northern California. Okay. So, there is, Skid Row. I think a lot of people who have
Mm-hmm.
any, yeah. So I
Mm-hmm.
went from that and I went to working on a project on Skid Row for years. And so that was the same crossroads of like every background you can imagine, and still like involving sex work and high risk and a lot of, trauma is what gets people there, and trauma is what gets us to most difficulties in our lives, and still having to integrate like sexual planning and sexual health with like mental health, that interaction and any reproduction that comes from that, because babies come from those things regardless of people's mental health states and their trauma. And I just, the work, it drives me. I'm just, I don't know, like this is for me, and it's very complex and it's extremely demanding, but for someone such as myself, it's very inspiring, and it definitely like guides everything I do all the time.
I can imagine, and it's like you know take this trip and you think it's going to be one thing, and it's sort of like this seed that just blooms in your head, and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is this massive issue that like needs a solution. We need more
Absolutely.
people, more brains, more energy
Right.
directed towards this thing, and you start to see like, okay, this is what needs to be fought, not like the status, not this or that. Like you start to see that like in comparing your old perceptions of like, oh, I just want to have this life and this lifestyle, and then you realize like some people don't even have the first step to just having their basic needs, let alone trying to
Exactly.
aspire for this like lifestyle. So I'm sure that must have been such a life changing experience for you.
Definitely. And it humanized so many issues. I think, if anything, and I would never say that I wasn't compassionate or empathic, but it's something very different to imagine the state that people are in, and versus being immersed in it when you're like in a position of service.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think moving from sympathy to empathy was probably the most important thing on an experiential level that happened for me with all of that. And now it became really important for me later in my life when my first marriage was extremely unhealthy, and it required putting myself in a lot of positions that I had never imagined to like get out.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things together, I'm just really passionate about people seeing each other on a level plane, like from a point of empathy, and it helped me do that. So yes, that's what I'm about.
And sort of speaking on that sort of passion, one of the things that one of the topics that you and I have sort of shared a really strong passion for is the never-ending process of decolonization, and specifically speaking,
Yes.
the work that's needed to recognize and understand all of the crap that's been passed down by our older generations, because
Yeah.
it's, it's not just, it's not just that you're taking in your mom's eyes or your grandpa's sense of humor that gets passed down.
Right.
For some people, they inherit generational trauma. For other people, they
Yes.
inherit this perpetual sense of like imposter syndrome. And so my
Yeah.
question to you is, how do we stop this cycle of passing down toxic behaviors and mentalities onto the next generation? And how is colonization sort of related to all of this kind of stuff?
So, I mean, I'm a really big fan of like putting the blame where it lies. And for me, that is with colonizers. In a really short sentence, it is with colonizers and with people who perpetuate colonization. So, like, I love having these conversations, and I think especially like intraculturally and interculturally, so like across cultures that are not white. I feel like there's so much, it's great. We get to this point. I think we're at this point of like parallel isolation in trying to figure ourselves out in our generation from a cultural standpoint, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean for me to be a Black and Creole woman in the United States? Or like, what does it mean to be, a Pacific Islander or Filipino or Korean or whoever, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever man, like especially as an American or as an immigrant or whatever the case may be. But in so doing, what's necessary for intersectionality is for us to maintain a bird's eye view of the things that bind us to each other. Because I think while our original indigenous cultures are really unique, our experience in colonizations are not nearly as unique as we
Yeah.
think they
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
at all. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
when you get into colorism, right? When you get into the way that sexism has infected all of our abilities to interact amongst ourselves, like the way that we interpret our own intimate relationships within our cultures and how that has been derailed. Like it's really extremely similar. And so I think one of the biggest things for us, as I'm going to use the term people of color, and I say that as a Black activist, knowing the the like unrest that it gives some people who are Black, but I'm saying it because I think it has value.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has value to distinguish the fact that people of color in no way, shape, or form represents, nor should it ever overshadow Blackness. Like that exists on its own. But
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, there is value in recognizing, especially in a world that has been inundated with colorism because of whiteness, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that being a person of color, we have more in common with each other than we have with people who have tried to separate themselves from all of us who aren't white, right? And so for me, I'm using that on purpose. But like as people of color, I think we really need to maintain connectivity in keeping an eye on each other and our parallel journeys, where they intersect and where they run side by side, because a lot of the healing that needs to be done, like the applications are going to be different because of the differences in our individual cultures, but the goals are not. I think the goals are the same. Like colorism is something that needs to be reduced really, really distinctly across Latinx cultures, across Asian cultures, and across Black culture. Because, surprisingly, people have not figured out that Black people come in all shades too, right? And so, like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's something that needs to happen. Decolonizing the way that we raise children, I think, is another place. That place and colorism are really just, like, we underestimate the degree to which all of us have suffered historically, like genocidal experiences under whiteness. All of us. Forms of enslavement, and slavery in the United States is probably the most famous because it's been the most contentious. And so I think it's been the most publicized. But the Britons they enslaved Indians for like literally from the moment they were there. Like, and it was not a secret, and they trafficked them and they moved them to Britain to do it, and so like keeping that in mind as a Black person who's an American, to remember that my experience in fighting whiteness and colonization is not one of isolation, and we have a lot of value amongst each other to go, even if the application was different, even if, okay, so you weren't being trafficked from continent to continent, but you were being enslaved in your own continent. Like, slavery is still slavery, and the impacts are still going to, they're still going to resound like across the generations in very similar ways. For me, I think amongst us, in the absence of people who are descendants of colonizers, that when we have these conversations, keeping that in mind is really, really important to me. I also think it serves as a form of bonding, and like not trauma bonding, although that is going to happen regardless. Like, I mean, it is, right? It's going to happen because so much of this stuff really comes from trauma. I'm not saying that to like make light of trauma bonding. I just don't think it's avoidable when you have people of color who are trying to address colonization, right? And I don't even necessarily think it's bad. I don't think it's bad for me to be able to find common ground, with someone else who shares my skin tone, but is from Southeast Asia, to talk about colorism and to talk about how that affects my relationships or my desirability as a woman. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that it's bad for us to bond over those things. I think that's a starting point. I think you don't stay there, like you both grow together towards healing, perhaps. But I think it has value for us to find commonality and to be able to bond with each other in a way that is divergent from reaching towards or running away from whiteness, if that makes sense, of like reshaping our own identities and our connections as people. So there's so many different ways, and I think there's value in all of the different methods that are being used as activists. But for me, that's something that I'm passionate about, and that's something that I try to foster, like in my connections, if that makes sense.
I really like what you said about, this idea that even though our experiences with systemic inequality and racism and white supremacy are all different, and our histories are all different, the effect of colonization, it essentially flattens everyone's differences, and it's sort of like the way that Asian community. I mean, Asian is so massive, and yet like
it's such a ridiculous, like, I hate, like, what is Asian, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because amongst the differences in Asia, like, nobody from India would ever look at someone from Korea and be like, we're Asian, right? I mean, exactly. Like, besides joking.
Like, yeah, exactly. And it's weird because it's like, in some ways it like, colonization in that flattening sense of like, okay, well, you're just all Asians, or, even worse, in the United States, oftentimes they'll just be like, okay, well, you're just all Chinese. Not to say anything about Chinese, but just like to narrow it down to just
everybody's
one.
Chinese when they're Asian.
And it's just like, it's this weird thing where it's like, it erases all of the differences and the nuance within our cultures. And I think that also offers these opportunities to like you said, find those connections and realize like, just in spite of the fact that we have all these differences, like, to recognize that under this same system, we all have suffered in a lot of ways that do share that commonality. And it's not to say, like I said, it's not to, play in the trauma of it all, but it's to recognize that like, hey, other communities have not only experienced this, but they also can have solutions for how we can understand it, how we can learn and grow from it.
Definitely. And I cling to the idea, and honestly, I got this idea from just growing up and the knowledge that I have of the Rainbow Coalition, that comes from the original Black Panthers. The concept that those of us who have been colonized will always have more in common with each other than we do with the people who try to decimate us. Like, for lack of a better word. And I think always trying to bear that in mind really serves to undo a lot of the divisiveness that we also deal with across different cultures and ethnic groups, because that divisiveness, again, exists because of whiteness. Like that's why I say, like, always put the blame where it lies, right? Like, where's the origin? And so for me, keeping all of those things in mind and then moving towards unity and goals, not necessarily application. Application for me has to be community specific. And I say community specific because even among ethnicities or cultures, like, there's still different community. Like, being a Filipino American is not the same as growing up in Manila, period. Like, it's just not. And being a Black American, even regionally, there's huge differences. Like, so I'm born and raised in California, which anybody can hear in my accent. Like, I speak as if that's the case, because it's true. So, like, me being born and raised in LA and, like, going through the Watts riots or the Rodney King riots, and, like, that's part of my identity. I don't know what it's like to grow up in the Bronx as a Black person, or like Harlem. I have absolutely no idea. I haven't even been there. And so, like, recognizing that communities have their own identities within the labels, that have been placed upon us. And so we honor community specific, like, applications of the goal, but then we, like, move in tandem, like, with each other towards the goal. So that's for me, that's how I apply intersectionality to, like, non-white interactions. And I think I feel like I've seen the most success, and I've also seen dismantling of a lot of inherited tension across our cultures, that I think that gets dismantled when we start looking at it a little bit differently. And it's not that we don't acknowledge that it exists, and we need to know where it comes from, but we don't have to operate within it because it doesn't serve us, right? Like, it's not, it is where we've been, and we need to know why, but it's not where we're going, right? So, like,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I talk to Asian Americans who are, so hesitant and so, like, afraid to, admit that anti-Blackness is a problem in our community, because they feel like it's, like, going to be this mark where, like, oh, you think I'm white now? You think it's like, no,
right.
like, you can acknowledge that this is a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed without feeling like that is your destiny, that, like, oh, well,
right.
then I guess I have to be that type of, anti-Black Asian. Like, no, like, we can recognize that that's a part of us, but it doesn't have to be us.
Right.
So
exactly.
Speaking of, different cultures and families of color, one topic that I am still learning about is neurodiversity within communities of color. And thankfully, this happens to be one of your areas of expertise. Unfortunately, some people of color get offended if you suggest that neurodiversity is normal within communities of color, because they still have this, like, super ableist view that being neurodivergent equals bad. So can you clear the air and tell us, is neurodivergence among communities of color, is it the exception or is it the rule?
I love this question, and you know that, so I'm going to try to not go on tangent. But it's I, like, try to sit here and, like, prepare my thoughts. I want to say initially, we have to remember that, well, in honor of the ancestors, like, their fears were valid, and they came from very real experiences. So I think acknowledging, I try to do this, like, in practice of my own, like, historic compassion, and also because, again, I think it's, like, grounding for all of us. So I think one of the privileges of being in our generation, especially as Americans who are not white, Americans of color, is that we've only read about what happened, like, to our parents and our grandparents. And that's something we need to acknowledge when we feel dismissive, or, like, as if we want to dilute the paranoia that we see that might exist in them. I say all of that to say, like, just to be Black or to be Asian 40 or 50 years ago was in and of itself enough of a divergence. And so if you tried to add a disability onto that, you were rendering yourself, sacrificial, more or less, like, to the system that we were in. So I want to acknowledge that and say, we're lucky that we're in a time that our existence with these issues is something that we can like talk about in a podcast.
Yeah,
So, like,
yeah, right.
this used to be right, like this used to be things that the adults like talked about in consternation and hushed tones, like at the dinner table after kids went to bed,
Yeah.
in households like ours, because it was dangerous. Like that
Mhm.
was the perception. And so I just want to acknowledge that and put that out there. Like also like not bring any bad karma on us. So we know that, but now because it's also because of their work and because of what they went through that we're at a place that we can openly challenge with less fundamental danger like to our existence. Like we're still going to deal with being ostracized and being harassed, but that's not the same as like your house is going to get porch bombed tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like that's less likely to happen, right? In acknowledging all of that, I want to say, so in psychology, and sociology, there's this phenomenon called, oh my God, my husband is behind me and he's snoring. So I hope
No worries.
if it doesn't get taken out, that's okay. Married or partnered people, this happens. Just ignore him. It'll be fine. Let me see if I can like, you're okay. It's all right. So what was I saying? Let's see. Yes, culturally bound syndromes. Long before, like in the 80s, before they were even like really acknowledging or expanding the degree to which neurodivergence could like manifest itself, there was a lot of international and anthropological research about culturally bound phenomenons and basically how mental health issues present themselves across cultures and the difference in treatment because of the difference in perception. So like in Asian cultures and African cultures, when people hear voices, they're actually originally in indigenous, we're not talking about like super westernized like areas, in indigenous cultures, amongst those people were actually seen as gifted and thought to like have a connection with God.
Wow.
So they didn't they didn't experience the same level of danger and mistreatment that like colonized societies did. Likewise, people who were neurodivergent, you know, it depended on how it was manifesting. So like if it was a child who would have otherwise been diagnosed with Asperger's, who was really, really good with numbers, they would frequently people would just celebrate their really good abilities, and the need to compensate in other areas was not seen as bad because conceptually it was like, well, of course they're not like doing that chore because all of their energy is going towards all of the math that they're writing all over the hut wall. You know what I mean? Like, so it was just, do you understand what I'm getting at? And so I think, I don't know, when we talk about neurodivergence being normal, I think the better term is normal. Like, what does normalization look like in non-colonized cultures of normalizing the value and the contributions of people whose brains work differently versus ostracizing them? And so for me, it's better to look at it that way for those reasons. Originally in most tribal cultures, there just wasn't like a such thing. I won't say there wasn't such thing as ableism because that's not true. But as far as we know, anthropologically, most ableism came from like physical stuff. Like if you could not contribute to the needs of the tribe from a survival standpoint, obviously certain people are going to have issues with that. And I think that's adjacent to Western ableism. I don't think that that's the same, because if you're in a hunter-gatherer society and it's someone who like has to be carried on somebody else's back, like well into their adulthood, that poses a different level of burden on a society who like depends on you being like, on you being able to ambulate, right? Because otherwise something might eat you. That's not the same as like, your kid being in school who's dyslexic and can't read, and the teacher who's literally there to teach them and it's their job, like looking down on them as a burden because they don't want to be bothered and they want to go home early today. You know what I mean? Like I don't approximate those two things personally. But yeah, I think in a modern sense, when we translate that now, the vast majority of the responses that we see in communities of color to neurodivergence are not endemic to our own culture. Like they don't come from our original culture. This comes from implicit trauma response and memory in our communities of like, the more you can be separated from whiteness is the greater danger you put yourself and potentially all of those who are attached to you in by people who were perpetuating whiteness, right? So like, you're posing a greater risk to us because you're making it more difficult for us to fit in, or you're making it more difficult, right? And so for me, I've noticed when I start phrasing people's fears around neurodivergence and communities of color that way, like people are like, whoa, 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 like, are you trying to say that I'm like being racist to my kid? And I'm like, not to your kid. I'm trying to say that you've internalized survival mechanisms in a society that's like basically hell-bent against you, and you're trying to hold your child to that view, and it is, it's to their detriment. And ultimately, that means that for you as a parent, it's to your detriment, because that means more trauma for both of you. That means, more work, less resources. That means more difficulty at home, more strife, less love, and all of these other things. So I think moving back towards this mindset of like, how do we normalize the idea of valuing someone regardless of how their existence manifests itself in the family, because that concept is very indigenous. Looking at someone and going, whatever your contributions are to the community are enough, and we're just going to find like where they belong and how they can help in whatever way, shape, or form that is, and that's going to be enough. Like, that's enough for you to be meaningful. Versus looking at them as like, oh my goodness, your differences make it so hard for us to acclimate in this Western. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. That's my shorthand contribution to that. I don't know if that answers the question. I have so much more in my head, but I'm trying to.
No, I love it, because I mean, you kind of like earlier on, you kind of, my mind exploded because I didn't even think about like that idea of, when we talk about the way that our minds work, or if we're hearing voices, and from a Western capitalistic perspective, like we know exactly how that maps out. Like, we've seen movies of like, oh, the dude with the voices, and he
yes,
he goes on this weird bender, and like we have all these narratives about what we think that is, and then we also have evaluations about what that means relative to especially in America, we're always obsessed about how that impacts productivity and work and your jobs and your career. Like, I mean, this is basically
money, basically.
Exactly. This is basically Dr. Phil's whole career wrapped up into one.
Yes, it is.
And so, like, I was so fascinated because that is really true, that we do so often think about neurodivergence from that perspective, when we don't think about like in the same way that food can be cultural and relative to these particular areas, so too can our perceptions of neurodiversity. And I think staying on that topic of neurodivergence, how would you respond when someone tries to say that conversations about neurodiversity don't include race? In other words, like, what's the difference?
Well, usually that's coming from someone who like is not of color, so I address the person and their enormous deficit on the topic most of the time. That's me being as kind as I possibly can. I'm not usually kind if it's a white person who has something to say about that. So everything involves race. For a person who deals with racism. That's my response to everybody the only person who thinks that race is not involved in any topic is the person who is part of a dominating race.
Yeah.
And I use dominating instead of dominant very intentionally. I don't think there's anything dominant about being white or whiteness. But the difference between like being dominant as if it's inherent and you have a right to it, versus dominating, which is like literally lording over someone in violence. Like, yes, you're part of a dominating race. Who bullies people? Of course you don't think race has anything to do with this. And then usually I just leave it and like let people flounder and like try to explain themselves. But like the shorthand is race is involved in everything, just like gender is. Just like Because everything that affects people's perception of you, everything that triggers stereotypes in someone's mind as soon as they hear you or see you is going to affect both how you're perceived and how you were treated. And that in turn, the blowback of that affects our capacity to see ourselves and how we identify and how we see our own identities. There's never a context where race is not relevant. There's never a context where race is not relevant, period. And people who think that there is not do not have to live with the effects of being ostracized for their race, bar none. Like that's what it is. Obviously we all know people who, and like, I love your page because you're constantly pointing this out and I appreciate that. But like, we all know people who are trying desperately to pretend that they are not part of our race. And I just feel like those are our own, right? That's a different conversation. That's like an internal conversation ethnically, but I think that those are manifestations of delusion, like that's just, unfortunately, some people's trauma with racism and with prejudice plays out in such a way that the only way that they have foreseen to attempt to escape it is to espouse. It's very much like, if you can't beat them, join them, Yeah. And in a spirit of compassion, like, although it makes me irate to watch people do that because of the effect that it has on the rest of us, I try to tell myself, like, it's coming from a place of extraordinary pain. Because when you get down to it, like, I'm going to use Candace Owens as an example. And I was going to say, I hope she doesn't hear this, but maybe I hope she does. I have no idea. It depends on how it's going to affect her. Candace Owens, it came to light that she had an extraordinarily, I'm sure that wasn't the first traumatic like incident that she dealt with, but like a very public lawsuit, right? Like where she was trying to get support for some extreme discrimination. And instead of moving towards advocacy, whatever happened to her in that process moved her to a place that she wanted to join people in denying her own mistreatment, because for her, that was a survival tactic to escape the pain, And I think, what were we talking about? We were talking about neurodivergence. Yeah, I think that within our own communities, because I don't care what white people think about like how race applies to the rest of us. I really don't. Like, I just want to throw a history book at them and like leave it alone. But within our own communities, when we hear people say these things, when we hear people try to separate the experience of ability in any way, shape, or form, any kind of ableism from the cross-sectionality of racism, I think we need to, whoever is closest to them and has the capacity sort of needs to have an intervention, for lack of a better word, and be like, what got you to the place that made you believe that this integral part of your history and your identity is irrelevant to your current experiences? And I've never seen I've been in a lot of interesting advocacy situations over the last 14 years, and I've never seen someone challenged, like who was Black, Asian, Hispanic, Indigenous, anything, where another person from their own culture looked at them and says, what happened to you that made you think you being an Asian woman or an Indigenous man or a Black, whatever, what happened to you that made you think that that wasn't an important part of your identity that did not get to them? I've never seen a situation where somebody was called out straight on, that it wasn't very obvious that that was just a cover up for unresolved pain. You know what I mean? So if it's within our communities, if it's within a social group of color where it is a person who clearly like shares our identity, whether they believe it or not, is trying to spout this idea that they can separate the experience of neurodivergence or any sort of disability or different ability, however you want to look at it, from experiencing racism, that's what I do. I just challenge it head on. And it's very, instead of arguing with them, like, let's get to the bottom of it. Why do you think that your identity doesn't matter? And you have to personalize it, right? Because like they're trying to depersonalize everything. They're trying to distance themselves from the effects, from the identity, from, the identification, from their being able to relate to you and your experiences by sharing an identity with you. If you personalize it and say, why do you think, like, God forbid you said something like that, I would ask you, like, what about your life has taught you that you being Asian, I don't know, do you identify as Asian? I've actually never seen you do that. Okay. Yeah. And what I would ask you, like, what about you has taught you that being Filipino was worthless. And I usually use really like deep cutting, right? Because
Yeah,
like,
yeah. It's like,
how do you
hey.
feel when somebody says that to you?
Yeah.
Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Like, and most people have been struggling with the idea of their ethnic identity being worthless or being dangerous. And so when you point it out and you challenge them with it, inevitably you will get somewhere. I'm not suggesting it'll be peaceful in the meantime, but sometimes you need that level of confrontation when
Mhm.
people are distancing themselves that far from reality. So I tend to be a little bit radical with most things. If it's a white person, I'm just going to go straight for that. And if it's a person of color, I'm going to ask them, like, what's happened to you? The reason why you don't think your ethnicity matters.
I love that question because, I always hate when, people ask these disingenuous questions because it's clear that they don't want to engage on the subject of race because they don't have
Right.
like, the actual experience or the knowledge or the ability to confidently talk about it. So they try to, like you said, they try to depersonalize it. They try to make it, they try to put these ideas into this, debate arena where, we can just
Right.
talk about these fun ideas as if they're not actually impacting real people. And so,
Right.
I love that you instead are just like going for the gut and saying, okay, well, why, like, why are you this way? Because it really
Right.
does expose, like what are the gears going on that have caused this belief to manifest? Because sometimes they
Right.
just say it as if it's like, well, this is the natural position. It's like, well,
We're like,
no.
no, this is your natural position. Like,
Exactly.
so explain yourself because the rest of us don't agree with that. So where are you coming from on this,
No,
right? Instead of
exactly.
generalizing your personal experience, let's personalize your general experience. You can explain why you feel that way.
And it
So
always
yeah,
works. It always gets them.
it does. It always gets somewhere.
So on the subject of systemic discrimination towards communities of color, one of the biggest problems is rampant medical discrimination, specifically
Yes.
towards pregnant and birthing parents. And you
Yes.
have called this problem out as a form of systemic genocide. And for our
That's
audience
right.
members who aren't aware of this massive issue, what's going on? Why is this problem so often overlooked? Oh, oops. All right. Sorry, your
We have
video
a.
cut out. Oh, are you able to hear
Oh,
me?
okay.
Okay. So
Yeah, I hear you fine.
let me just start over with the question.
Sure.
So on the subject of systemic discrimination towards communities of color, one of the biggest problems is rampant medical discrimination, specifically towards pregnant and birthing parents. You have
Hmm.
called this problem out as a form of systemic genocide. And for our
That's
audience
right.
members who aren't aware of this massive problem, what is going on? Why is this problem so often overlooked? And who at the very end is actually benefiting from this problem from continuing?
Um, I mean, just so that I'm clear that I'm standing on the shoulders of people who came before me, which is the case for most of us who are advocates. So I call it out, but I am one voice among very many. Like if you get on Twitter, and I'll try and like give some of these resources because there's some really important people to follow who day in and day out are like just a sounding board for this. I've been a family doula and a parent coach for a decade now. Wow.
Wow.
So I wanted to think about that. And so that's been like my private practice. So like outside of the research and the case management and the like clinical care that I did in hospitals and in the educational system and whatnot. I worked in private offices as a parent educator and like in people's homes as a doula. And I'm on a project right now where we're like working on some virtual doula stuff, like specifically for partners and parents to really, really to form like really intense bonds as baby comes home, which I think is important and also like reflects Indigenous values. And I'm obviously very into that. All of that is restorative work. Um, to answer one of the questions, because I think that's the origin of the issue, is like who benefits from it. I'm going to work backwards in the question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the people who were doing it benefit from it. So, like, again, it's you know my theory on this: put the blame where it lies. And so, um, colonizers are always the people who benefit from controlling our birth rates, from controlling and really putting pressure on and cultural suffocation with our ability to aptly parent. And I'm not just talking about like the manner in which we do that and how we view our own children and you know, treat them at home. It's also lack of resources, intentional lack of resources, lack of ability to find compassionate and adequate care is a huge problem. Educators that do not humanize our children is a huge problem. And so I feel like the pressure is unending when you are not white as a parent to try and raise your child with any form of success or love. But, you know, it starts at the beginning. And I just want to say this as to not just as a form of respect, but like in a spirit of accountability. I don't say that it is systemic genocide lightly. I want to be very clear. I understand this is a radical position, and I'm obviously not speaking for you. I'm speaking for yourself, but I make it a point to be loud about it. I strongly believe that the entire North American continent, I would say absent of Mexico, but that's not true because Spanish people are European and they also colonized Mexico. That's for a different conversation. Canada and the United States, these countries literally only exist because of genocide. Like, just to be very explicit. And what is happening right now this week, which I'm sure you've seen, which all of these quote unquote, I hate this name. It's such a terrible, it's such a deceitful name. Residential schools. It's like really like relocation area. Do you know what I mean? I'm bringing this up because I think it's important. Like, to pretend that what is happening in our systems that is literally killing, I mean, the rate of likelihood of death for Black women is 44 times higher than white women. There is no way, statistically, culturally, mathematically, any way, shape, or form that you could ever pretend that that is an accident or an incident. Like, it's happening because it's on purpose. Like, this is intentional, and it has been perpetuated for a long, long time. In a spirit of accountability, there's never been a point in us trying to thrive within a society that literally is built on our destruction that there have not been efforts to destroy our children. And so I'm pointing out, both in reverence and accountability, what's going on with the quote unquote residential schools, you know, religious separation centers. They literally took those kids for what, like 12 years, and the parents couldn't even see. It's so surreal. It's like straight out of a horror movie, literally, especially. And now they're like, unmarked graves. I'm like, no, that was a mass dump. Gosh. They killed those children and they like, give me a break, right? Yeah. Like, let's be real about what was going on. We need to contextualize all of these things and see them as a continuum in a very, very specific effort to destroy entire portions of the population, not as little tiny segments of like, oh, and this happened. Like, it's not like a little tiny point in a timeline. Like, this is an entire effort. So yes, I think the people who benefit from it are those who are perpetuating the destruction. There's a lot of white people who are going to have a really hard time hearing that. And I'm talking about white people now in our generation. Like, what do you mean I benefit from genocide? Well, not having anybody else to compete with. Pause. I don't believe in, but you know where I'm going with this. So capitalism is the religion of whiteness for me. That's really what it's about. And I use religion on purpose, not because I think it's spiritual, but because people worship it. Yeah. So capitalism is the religion of whiteness. And capitalism is driven by violent competition. There's nothing fair about it. So if we're looking in the context of the culture of the people who are perpetuating this, like, if they perceive everything and everybody around them as competition, then they try to eliminate their competition. Like, this is literally in business classes everywhere, except we're taught to depersonalize it when actually, like, it's one of the most personal, terrible, direct experiences ever for anybody who's not white. And I think people, you know, the well-meaning white people, the ones who are going to the Black Lives Matter protests, who we sometimes sit around with and like share a beer or whatever's going on, they need to hear this because there is still an effort to separate capital from culture, and you just can't. Like, everything, it's a circle, it's not like a series of dots, right? Everything's connected in this. So the people who are benefiting from it are those who seek to eliminate what they perceive as competition for resources that they absolutely want to suffocate for themselves. Like, realistically, mathematically, from an economic standpoint, we have enough people who are trying to decolonize economics that we know that this is actually futile. Like, in the end, it comes back so far around that they cut themselves off at the ankles doing this, right? Like, treating it like a competition, treating resources as if they are scarce, actually creates way more aggression and destruction of resources than it does like maintaining resources, right? We know that. Like, the process of competing over resources is literally what's eliminating them. And if we cut the competition and did things in an indigenous way, we would not have any of these issues. We would have like a system of sustenance. But because that's not the system that we live in, they are eliminating us and also eliminating the resources along with us, right? Like, that's really what's happening. And then claiming that it's our fault and like, well, we have to compete for these resources that we keep destroying along with the people that come with them, like making their own problem and then blaming it on the rest of us. So I think that's my whole answer to most of that question. Like, the people who are perpetuating it are the ones who are benefiting from it. But even that, we have to put that in quotations, because ultimately, if you're destroying the entire world that you're on to try and hold onto things that won't serve you if you can't breathe because you keep cutting down all of the forests that the rest of us were living in, you're going to end up with the very problem that you claim to be, trying to escape. Which is something that's like a reckoning that our children are probably going to have to deal with, or us. But yeah, it's colonizers' immediate benefit. I think the immediate benefit, because in the long run, suffocating resources is not helping them at all. But in the short term, it's just power. Like, it's just the indulgence of knowing that I can lord over somebody else, honestly. And people don't like to hear that, but that's the truth. That's the truth.
And you said it great, like, just the inherent brutal competitiveness of capitalism why would people not think that, the same system that is willingly going to, evict people during the beginning of a pandemic,
right? Then be mad at them that they don't come to work for $7.25 an hour. Exactly. It fascinates me in the same paragraph.
Yeah, and people think that same system wouldn't and doesn't have the same capacity to strategically enact genocide through policies, through a lack of resources. And it's just... You know what? It doesn't even have to be policy. The policy can be lack of accountability for people who are racist. I'm just being completely, like, it does not have to be nearly as direct and explicit as people think it has to be. It used to be. It used to be, when there were quotients on how many people who were Chinese and Korean could come into the United States. And where they could live and whatever else, when Jim Crow was open and loud. But now it's soft and quiet, now it's redlining. Now it's going into a neighborhood where people think you don't belong and a banker simply never seeing you for that loan appointment, but ultimately those things all involve a lack of accountability systemically, which is like also what happens with police officers. It just happened in the Chauvin trial, like 22 years, not 225 years. What is wrong? Like, you know what I mean? Like, the worst thing I saw, I don't know if you saw it on my timeline, but somebody put up, and I love these and I hate them at the same time, but they're just such a perfect illustration of how hypocritical and like the BS that's being pushed down our throat with the two different justice systems that we all live in. Was an older Black man who was a gardener, and he quote unquote stole a hedge clipper, and it was like in the shed in somebody else's hedge clipper, and like, it was probably an accident. Even if it wasn't an accident, who cares? It's a hedge clipper. He took it to do his job. He got 23 years without parole, and Chauvin gets 22.5. Yeah.
So for me, it's like, in these situations, it's the lack of accountability. It's the refusal of people who have the power to enforce consequences for this audacity like that is also systemic when it's happening across the board, when nobody who's in charge is willing to listen to the people who are protesting it or do anything about it. That's still systemic. That is still an entire system working together to ignore the fact that the only change that's going to happen is if we look at these situations and go, that is ridiculous and how dare you. Like, and that has to be changed. That happens in the medical system all the time. Like the concept of the good old boys network, you can have policies in place, but if they aren't applied and if they aren't justly or equitably interpreted, then they are meaningless. And so that's basically what's happening.
And you saying about the whole, the shift from, okay, racism has to be, it only exists in, if it's written on paper, and this idea of this inequality being bred culturally in a soft way, where it's like you can't, how are you going to prove that your employer is discriminating against you, and how are you going to prove that your employer is constantly gaslighting you? And this is what's like so difficult. And I think this is also in some ways bleeds into conversations right now about what's going on with the Republican fear of CRT, critical race theory.
Oh, and, Lord.
Basically now just not only are we going to dismiss the fact that this is currently a problem, but we're going to erase it, through history. So that way we can, there's absolutely no way to even prove that this problem even exists. And so, in terms of like how it's, how it's warping us, it's affecting us on this huge scale. But shifting lanes a bit, another thing that you and I have sort of invested a lot of time and energy towards on a more positive light is support for online communities of color. One of my biggest pet peeves is when people casually dismiss folks who spend time in online communities as if, nothing gets done because we're all just hiding behind our phones. In reality, it's like so many of these online communities of color have done massive work towards, supporting their local communities, setting up mutual aid funds, hosting donation drives.
Absolutely.
This was especially true when the pandemic started, and like on Facebook, like Facebook groups started to be a really safe space for a lot of people to go ahead and ask help. And so your experience in this area is really fascinating because you've worked with online communities to specifically provide family care. What's that experience been like for you, and what have you learned from doing this kind of work?
It's been really rewarding, actually. And what I've learned is that every tool has value, and the degree to which it is impactful is based on how it's applied. Like if I could put it in one sentence, I think it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. It's like for a way that our parents probably phrased it growing up. Honestly, a lot of our communities have resorted to finding connectivity online out of desperation. Like originally, and that's just me being authentic, and I'm including myself in that. Honestly, honestly, it was out of desperation because we don't, there's so many fascinating things involved in this. And so I just want to put this out there that Dr. Karen Scott and Dr. McLemore, and I'll mention some other people. Who else am I forgetting? Dr. Ifinwea from UCSF. They did some amazing research on how outcomes in maternal child health, mental health, and also like infant feeding rates shifted drastically once Black women specifically had communal spaces online to discuss their concerns about racism, about the intercultural and intergenerational tension, about like how you're going to raise your kids and like what changes you're going to make. Huge changes over the course of a few years in reports about feeling supported, about feeling stable in one's parenting, about knowing where to go to get help, to get resources, and knowing who you could depend on. So they basically saw, the previous idea of like that peer support has to be in person, and it doesn't. It just has to be at a reliable place that you can control where you access listen with people that you trust. And those things can all be established online. So I just want to throw that out there, that like, this is not hypothetical. And, you know, you and I, we probably take for granted that, like, I don't know about you, but I'm always like reading up about this stuff. Like I have so much like news and like research and stuff that I'm reading every day. And so we can have these conversations, and I gloss over all these topics. And for a lot of people, it's so much new information. But like, I'll give my contact information. I'm really big on like references and stuff. So if people want, please ask me where I got the information from. You know what I mean? If it is my own theory and it's out of my own mouth, I'll always like own up to that. But 99% of what you're hearing is like actual real like research and studies that people have done. So that's my initial reaction to how impactful and like what a positive difference it can make. I think on a personal level, you know, my experience with it has been twofold. And I'm sure you can attest to this. Like, it's very powerful. And I think even now, our generation, as we're submersed in it, it's sort of like being a fish, you don't notice the water. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So there's like a storm. I know I underestimate the extraordinary power that's wielded in interactions online. And it's probably to our benefit that we underestimate it, because if we thought about the long-term impact, like, I don't know, I might be like I might freeze every time I got on here. But I think it definitely can go both ways. There's absolutely an endless dark side to being like interacting online. And there's some people who just live there, and that's how it is. But on the positive end of things, back to talking about like going here for desperation, I think you know, living in a capitalistic society, and especially those of us who are privileged people of color who, you know, we have an education, we are living in circumstances that are considerably better. You know, it's one of those things where if you look at like families of color, and every generation is like living a little bit better from capitalistic standards, like those of us who, I know that that's me, right? And it's probably you, and it's, you know, many of our friends. I think for us, we start to really lose touch with certain parts of our community that maybe came from more humble circumstances. Mm-hmm. And there is this ability to establish and maintain those connections with other people in the same situation, but who like share our ethnicity or share our backgrounds or share certain parts of our histories that we're trying to bring with us and maintain. You can find that online, and you can intentionally get up every day with other people who share this same desire, and just like create that connection and create these friendships. And I think there's something really, really special and valuable about that. Mm-hmm. Our parents were limited. Like, we always talk about like, oh, things are better in person, but they're not always better in person. No. Sometimes you get stuck in subpar relationships with people also out of desperation because our parents were limited to the people who they could get to, like, physically. And maybe those people weren't so great, or like weren't of like minds, or, you know, didn't serve the growth that they needed. So I think recognizing the two sides to every coin, like, sort of value judgment about comparing in-person interactions versus online interactions is important. I know that people, well, white people, to be honest, can claim that like this creates a silo, but the only people creating silos are them. Like, we live in a white world. I spend all day long navigating like interactions and situations that were not made for me. So the capacity to be able to create a reverent space online where you're in charge, where you can keep people from harassing you, you know, to an extent. Some people try very hard, but you know what I mean? Like, you have a measure of control over your own voice and your own communication and your own connections is revolutionary. Like, when have people of color ever had that sort of power in our relationships in the recent past? So for me, I do think it's fascinating. I don't think that it's all positive, but I do think that the capacity for positive impact outweighs, like, in terms of support and connections, outweighs the negatives, because those things that are negative exist, like, regardless of whether you're interacting with people online. So it's not limited to the internet, right? Yeah. There's certain really, really specific things in terms of finding support and creating relationships and being able to control and protect your space. Like, I'm really passionate about teaching. So I do one of the things that I fell into, because I think being an introvert like makes me better at this. But I can just go through like, I'm a really good moderator. I go through lots of comments every day, but I help curate groups, like people who want a certain culture in their group. I help curate that. And I work with influencers over curating their page and their image, but especially like curator like of color, and sort of like keeping the peace and keeping things synergistic and like creating a space that invites the people that you want to grow it in the way that you want to grow it. Because having large numbers does not mean having success. Oftentimes it can just be extraordinary conflict and then that's what your page is going to be known for, right? So like it's better to start off small and specific and have like the feel that you want, so to speak, and have it grow very like intentionally from there. So I help curate, and I run right now I actually run a couple moms groups, one that's really huge. It's like close to 100,000. And I'm one of the only Black moderators in there. But it's interesting because I'm in a position where every day I get to do like cultural race education, like among the other moderators. And they're very receptive because they know that's why I'm there, if that makes sense. There's a couple other mods who are Black and Hispanic, and one who is Asian, but they are less comfortable being confrontational than I am. So it falls to me most of the time, and that's okay. Like I do it in a way that everybody grows. But I think the capacity to do there, it's so strange because you can have such parallel interactions. Like you understand this. You can be moderating on a group thread or on a sub thread, and at the same time having a conversation with your moderators about specifically what are we trying to take this conversation to. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and it's almost impossible to ever do that in public.
Yep. No, exactly.
In public, in public, there's no strategy. You can come in with a strategy if you want, but there's so little time. There's no space between how you can respond versus needing to react, right? And so I just think as people of color, we have the ability to create cultural mind shift if we're really strategic about it online. That's something I love about watching how you've evolved in your page. I feel like I've watched you do that. Like there's clearly strategy among your moderators, and I identify it because I participate in it every day. So like I understand the work that it takes. It's such an investment, but it is actually impactful because when you have a massive amount of people following you, they evolve with you. Their mind perspective evolves with you if you're strategic enough about it. And people can get into arguments on your thread, and now you have the ability to pause the thread. You can limit how quickly people respond. These are not things that you can do in person in any way, shape, or like that's some Black Mirror shit. Excuse my French. But it's so useful online because there's so many important conversations happening. And so you have the ability to control them and steer them in a way that they go towards like a direction of progress. And that would never happen. It would just completely denigrate into a fight, right? Because of all of our propensities towards reactivity as humans in person, and like perception of threat and, being able to see somebody's face while they're typing is incredibly different than just reading what they wrote online. So I don't know, I find those specific parts of it really fascinating. And I think there's great value for all of us who are in advocacy and who are in, racial cultural change work to use those to our advantage to the extent that Zuck is going to allow us. That's also for that's a different conversation, but you know what I mean? Like it's still more than we've ever had. It's more power over our communication and our response, and over the conversations about us than I think we've ever had. And I hope people start looking at it that way.
I'm so glad that you said that because, I've, for such a long time as somebody who does branding and social media, I have, and especially also being from a more traditional Asian family, I've always, in my mind and to my family and to my peers, I've always had to sort of like justify what I do because there's always a tendency to like dismiss it as like
Black families too. They're like, oh, you're just playing online.
Oh my God, yeah. You're just on the internet. I'm just like,
You're always glued to that phone.
Yeah.
And I tell them now, like, this phone pays me. Stop making fun of me about it.
Exactly. It's like, I mean, even like, I always hate having to like justify it from a financial perspective because I don't think that's what the
I
value.
know, but that's what they understand.
Exactly, and you have to speak that language first.
Yes.
And it's unfortunately because you can't like and you really beautifully covered the those two sides of it because I mean obviously I could talk at length at like the toxicity of groups and like
yes
the way that people go to these groups and use it as a predatory.
I'm trying to keep it positive. We're talking about positive things.
Exactly. But I mean on that positive note, I mean this was the subject of my TED Talk where I was talking about the way that social media is an amazing landscape for activists from all different kind of communities because like you said before it's like people always try to romanticize in-person communication as if it's this like it's the god tier communication.
No.
But as coming from someone who also study communication studies, it's like there are so many people who don't communicate that way. There are some people who prefer writing. There are some people who prefer being on a video. There are some people who, have disabilities where it's difficult to communicate. And so,
absolutely,
by having an online space, you really do open up the floor for so many different people to express themselves in a number of different ways. And ultimately, that is, one of the biggest core benefits of social media is it gives people a way to communicate how they want to communicate, because it's totally different if we're like, okay, we wanted to go ahead and talk about race, let's go into a building and let's go talk about it, because then it's like whoever's the biggest personality, whoever has the loudest voice,
absolutely,
whoever's
navigate. The most charismatic, right, or manipulative, as the case may be.
Exactly.
But then there's also perception privilege there. Like, let's talk about that. In person, we're all still like shackled to our biases. There's something people always talk about, like hiding behind the keyboard. But there's actually identity blindness online contributes to the capacity for progress. I promise you it does. Like, obviously it can go both ways, but since we're talking about the positivities, there is something about my ability to cloak my identity and make comments. And I'm sure you've noticed this. I know you have, because most of us who are influencers, like right now I have up like a cartoonized picture of myself, but frequently, especially when I'm about to do certain campaigns, I will change it to something that is non-identifiable and nobody can see who I am, who I'm married to, what I look like, on purpose. The way that I am perceived differently when I make the same comments across the board, when people think they know who I am and when they don't, it's incomparable. It's incomparable. And so we have to remember that everything that happens in person is involving so much emotional reactivity and so much of our perception and so much of our inherently held stereotypes that we don't realize that we're acting on. So as people of color, I think it's to our advantage to really think about like the reverse psychology aspect to this, right? Yeah. And use it to our advantage.
Yeah, it was funny because I was in VR once. I was on a social VR app, and they had like little events that you can attend. And I remember there was a event for queer communities and allies, and I was like, okay, I've never been to this event. It was I think it was called AltSpace. The app was on AltSpace VR, and I was attending this thing, and this one person was talking, and they were a robot. They were a robot in VR space, and I think I was like Goku or whatever. And I remember in this conversation, they said something that kind of like really blew my mind. They were talking about how VR is such an amazing space for a lot of trans people, because a lot of trans folks can create the avatar and then look down and see the body that is representative of how they feel inside. And
that's got to be so beautiful. That's giving me chills.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I like, that's how I felt. I was like, whoa, that's really powerful, because similar to what you were saying about this effect of, it's not even just it's more than just how other people perceive you, but it's also how you are being able to perceive yourself.
Absolutely, projecting your ability to project your identity the way you want to be seen.
Exactly.
Definitely.
And so I think zooming out on this topic a bit, but still staying on the topic of online communities, how do you think other communities, other grassroots online communities, here on Facebook or anywhere else, how can they use their collective power to not only support individual people, but actually to advocate for social issues like family care on
Yeah.
a systemic or political level?
I mean, to be honest, I think on a grassroots level, most of us are doing that already. Most of the huge influencers of color now became that way because they were just real loud voices like a couple of years ago, and then they created public pages and they got popular. So I don't think that capitalism and just colonization, they have these obsessions with like creating social formulas, and I don't think that that's appropriate. I feel like online interactions are one of the most dynamic and potentially unpredictable like patterns that we've ever seen in society, because it's like warp speed social change, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to like sort of get into that formulaic mindset to limit it. I think that most of us who are advocates, who are not white specifically, that we should rely on our like inherent gut feelings, honestly, about what needs to be done at that moment. I think our capacity to survive the last 200 to 500 years of colonization has built in a lot of intuition for most of us. And I also think that it's much easier for us to navigate our intuition online, again, because of the separation between immediate social reactivity of someone in your physical space, like
Mm-hmm.
lacking that threat, because
Mm-hmm.
for most of us, that's a threat. Not having to navigate that allows us to employ and apply our perception and our intuition and our strategy and our discernment in a way that we would not normally be able to. And so I don't know, my message towards grassroots advocates of color is one of empowerment and to trust yourself. Frequently in the beginning too, what people are doing, what ends up becoming the most powerful new mechanism of like, of the blitzkrieg, so to speak, like of the day. When people start out, it's so aggravating to the people around them. Like that's one of the things that makes them popular, is people just like being bothered by how they're doing something. So I think bearing that in mind and really trusting your own self about how you think something needs to be applied is really important. Um, with that said, there's some people, like someone who I follow, again, who started off pretty small, is like Allie Henny, who's
Mm-hmm.
a
Yeah.
writer. I don't know, you follow her, so I'm going
Yeah.
to use her as an example. She's very non-traditional. She's not super confrontational, but she's very matter of fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's other people who are far more confrontational, like Son of Baldwin, who, like, I love them both so much, and their styles are completely different.
Very different.
But the overlap of their impact is intense, and I feel like it gives pressure from opposing angles that accelerates progress, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like if you're just looking at like social physics, looking from a physics standpoint, you don't want to be the same as everyone else, because in order to reach large aspects of the population, we need people who are going to come from different angles. So I tend to resist this idea of like, what's the way that I don't know, like, what's your way?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I think there's sincere value in like diverse, what's the word I'm looking for? In diverse methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my message, which is probably not helpful for people who want a recipe. But I think if you're meant for this work, that that, and your drive is going to tell you that, and to really just trust yourself and your own abilities, and the way that you were able to reach people or get under people's skin or make people think is in and of itself valuable. There's 8 billion people on the planet, and if you reach 1 million of them, that's great. Like whatever
Mm-hmm.
method you use to reach them is enough, is better than you not doing it. So I think looking at it that way, and looking at it from the standpoint of the more diverse methods we have, is the more ground that we're going to cover, is better than like one specific way. And on watching who has become successful and impactful online, I think is a really good example of not limiting ourselves to a way, so to speak.
Oh yeah, I mean when we're talking about like online communities, and earlier you had mentioned something that I also really loved, which is the ability of online spaces to be able to really design the environment in order to
Yeah.
create conversations that steer us towards progress, because it's so easy to,
Absolutely.
conversations to divulge into like straight
Yes.
trolling and like memeing and stuff like that. And, that's sort of like
Yes.
the default of the internet, and especially Facebook.
Yes.
But it's like, when you're able to, and I love the way that you sort of wrapped in this idea of social physics, and how you can, like,
Yeah.
certain online communities, you can, like, I've seen people in the comments section go from like 0 to 100 on certain issues where they're like, I
Yeah.
didn't know that at all. And it's like, a light bulb goes off. And I remember when
Yes.
I was first starting to post on social media when it was like the mid 2010s, and my page started to grow, and I started to get more of these comments of like, oh, I didn't know about this thing, or I didn't learn about this in high school or college. Thank you for teaching me. And then I just had this like realization, like holy crap, like, we really can customize like every post. If I want to blow the
Every
lid
post.
off of something,
Right.
every post can be like dynamite, and
That's
that's what was
right.
so exciting about it. And that's why I also really love you talking about how this thing can't fully be, it's not a template. Like, you can't just be
No.
like, like, even when I talk, even at my agency, when I'm teaching my clients about branding and building their online communities, part of what we do is helping them actually accept who it is they are, and being able to,
Absolutely. Like standing in your truth as a brand. Who are you?
Mhm.
Own that and promote it 100%.
because
Yeah.
it's so easy to
Stop
be,
trying to please everyone. Like,
Mhm.
find your niche, find your place. Yeah, I agree
exactly,
with
because
that.
it's so easy, especially for people of color who, like, when you're trying to find symbols of success, and sometimes it's like, okay, well,
Right.
just like white people, just like read white people's tips and white people's YouTube videos
Yeah,
of
don't.
how to get rich and whatnot. And so like, I love that advocacy of more organic communities that are really built off of the intuition of just, some good leaders and good community leaders. So I love that. And oh, sorry, what you can say?
I was just going to say, I think we need to, we talk a lot about how valuable diversity is, and we need to be aggressive about displaying it
Yeah.
in valuing each other's various methods of existing and promotion, like promoting our own existence as valuable, as different valuable like methods of making change in the community. And so that's my contribution to that answer.
And you talking about like, the value of diversity has so much to do with like you said, covering ground and being able to
Yeah.
expose things that it's not necessarily trying to say that one is better than the other. It's just about one
Right.
has something that the other person doesn't know, and some of us
Exactly.
will never have the capacity to be able to understand. And so it's like,
Right.
why not add everyone's thoughts and contributions to the pool, so we can at least sort of like broaden this map out and at least expose
Right.
everything on the table. Well,
Absolutely.
Leah, it has been an honor chatting with you. I honestly, like, so many, mind-blowing moments. I learned so much talking to you. It was great. But before we head out, what are you working on right now these days? What have you been up to, and where can we find you?
So I'm under like a series of NDAs right now, and I can't talk about what I'm working on yet. Something I'm sure you understand since you work with branding. I will be able to, like, really, really soon though. So like, hopefully I'll be allowed to give an update. Let's just say I'm doing some things in, trauma-informed parenting support and technology.
Wow.
That's my overall, yeah. So like, I'm doing 2 projects right now that have to do with that I'm really excited about. I am also in the pitch stages of 2 books. So that's fun. My husband is like just making sure that's just an arm. Yeah, I'm in the pitch stages of 2 books. But that's the professional stuff. On a personal level, honestly, so I'm a long COVID survivor.
Wow.
And I've got the neurologic symptoms. I had like a bunch of seizures and stuff like that were ongoing for months.
Wow.
I had the brain fog has gone away, which is great. And I'm saying this right now because the pandemic's not over. Like, not so much. I don't like love sharing my medical history, but I feel like people need to hear about this. I'm saying this so I can put it out there. I have the letter and I keep looking at it and I haven't sent it, but I'm about to start like trying to do some legislative advocacy about long COVID survivors because the majority of them are women and women of color. And like we already have enough issues bothering us. So one of the like just send your good energy and your prayers. I'm putting that out there that I went to advocate for that. So like on a personal level, I'm doing that. And other than that, I'm just like turning into poison ivy in my house, which is like my other aesthetic.
Plants.
Plants. Like you're my Facebook friend. You see like my whole life at home is like cook all the food, grow all the plants. So that's me in a nutshell.
Good. Well, if anybody wants to be able to see your plant family, where can they find you on social media?
I closed down my public pages in the last year because I was making this huge move overseas. But I'll be opening things back up on Femme Doulala, which is like Femme Doula. Femme Doulala is going to be the public page that we're moving to. So people can find me over there. And we're opening it back up on the 4th of July. So will be open from them. We're curating some of our content. And that's going to be all things like integrative, people of color, like family. And on that page, we also concentrate a lot on like multiracial families and multiracial partnering, which is controversial still. And I'm sure you and I could do an entire podcast just talking about that. So maybe for later. But yeah, we concentrate on diversity of experiences and just like a lot of integration with the family doula situation. So people can find me there.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure people would love to be able to check out some of your work and your books whenever they are up and out for everybody. So whenever your book comes out, we'd love to go ahead and have you back on, Leah. It's been great. Hope you have a nice night. All right. Take
Thanks.
care. All right.
Bye.